it's important to notice when we're too focused on that sense of our bounded, ego-based, separate identity. And, to be engaged in a kind of set of practices that can deliver us when we're getting stuck.
Hello, and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. In this episode, I talked to law professor and mindfulness leader Rhonda Magee about her book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice. In this episode, we discuss her innovative approach to healing racial divides using mindfulness. Rhonda argues that when we bring awareness and compassion to ourselves, relationships, and the environment, we invite healing and connection. We also touch on the topics of education, spirituality, liberation, democracy, and community. So without further ado, I bring you Rhonda Magee. Wow, I'm really excited to talk to you today, and I thought we could just dive in because let's just have an informal chat,
Yes, let's do. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to have this chat. I'm a fan of your work and really just appreciating what you're offering right now in the world that needs some, so many different sources of support. And I see you as definitely offering that, and I appreciate that very much.
Thank you so much for saying that. And I feel the same way about you. Your name just kept coming up among so many people that I follow and that I love, like Sharon Salzberg and my friend Corey Mascara, and who are meditators. And your work just kept cropping up, and I love it. Absolutely love it. So I thought a really good place to start would be a little bit about your early childhood experiences, since this is the Psychology Podcast after all.
Yes. Yeah.
Would you feel comfortable talking about that a little bit?
Yeah. Yes. I was born in North Carolina to parents who had their own heritage and legacy in the soil and social and cultural context of the southern United States. I was actually born in North Carolina. My mother is from North Carolina. My father was from the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, which has some, Biloxi in this part of Mississippi is known as a place that has at least some appeal for those who delight in gambling, I guess, and just coastal living. But to be a Black man growing up in that part of the country was not so much filled with that. In fact, when he was growing up in the 40s and 50s, it would have been illegal for him to enter into the water, actually, in many parts of the coastline. And so my father actually kind of left Mississippi and joined the Marines during a time of war. He served in the Vietnam War. And my mother
So did my dad. I wonder if they knew each other.
Really? Yeah. My dad was in the Marines.
Oh, the Marines. Sorry. No,
yeah.
He was in the Air Force.
In the Air Force. Yeah, but still, it's service.
Who knows?
Yeah. During a time of war. Yeah. So, and my mother had, worked for a shirt factory and done other kinds of, low-skilled working class, employment. And neither of them had gone to college. And so I say all that to say, I'm like so many people in the United States. On the one hand, somebody who's benefited from, all of the ways that a prior generation or two and more have struggled to open up opportunity more broadly for people whose backgrounds don't afford them a lot of opportunity. We were, relatively poor growing up. All of the ways that the history of enslavement and segregation impact the family were present. So impoverishment, alcoholism was something that my family experienced and I witnessed, and then also some of the follow-on effects that can happen from that, including physical abuse, domestic violence in my home. And so, and then subsequently my mother and father divorced, married a stepfather who was also another military veteran, this time, in fact, the Air Force. And, nevertheless, we saw similar patterns of alcohol abuse and abuse in the household that impacted me as well, directly as well. So, I at the same time, I had the good fortune of being somehow well suited for, the way we study in public schools. And I say that intentionally. I mean, it's not to say that there aren't other ways we could be doing education that could bring more of us along, but I certainly had the kind of capacity for patience, for, long-term, sort of persistence and all of the sorts of things that can when coupled with some kind of ability, which I think we all have to learn, can make one excel. So school was a place where I actually did find validation and found a relatively safer place for me to grow and develop. And certainly without the teachers and the community that I found there and the affirmation of my abilities and my value that I found consistently through my own personal public school experience, I wouldn't be here without all that. So, yeah, that's a little bit of my background.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I hope it wasn't too painful to talk about.
No, I have thought about it and done some work on this, right? So it's actually not terribly painful, but it is something that I think is important for us to look at for all of us, because
absolutely
those difficult things, as you know, are part of who and how we are, wherever we are.
Absolutely. I was wondering, just personally in school, did you have many experiences of racism that impeded your ability to learn and grow?
Well, it's a good question, because I think implicit in that is this question of what do we think of when we think of the term racism. I think sometimes
feel free to answer that question too.
Right.
Feel free.
Well, we tend to think of it as like these explicit. So we think of racism as like a personal characteristic. We've been sort of trained. Many of us are working with this broadening of our understanding of what racism might be to include more subtle, systemic, maybe unconscious or less than explicit manifestations of it. But I think for many of us of a certain age, we really imbibe this message. And I think most of us in the U.S. still today are working with a kind of a core definition of racism that is about, a kind of a personal commitment to an ideology and practices that reflect it, that are committed to an idea of categorized humanity, right? Placing human beings in these categories of race, being placed in a category ourselves, and then rank ordering groups and therefore individuals who fall within those groups based on notions of implicit values, culture, sometimes religious, sometimes language. There are lots of different inputs to the ideas we have imbibed about race and racism. And so there are many dimensions of that. Of course, there certainly can be this, again, the traditional, I think, kind of core paradigm that we still work with is like an individual who is committed to these ideas and promulgating them and maybe performing a certain kind of like outsized with the hood and the, the swastikas, maybe an explicit commitment to these values and ideas is kind of, I think, still the core of what we think of when we think of racism and what it looks like. But of course, more subtle forms and systemic collective forms are the ones that are, the water in which we swim, the air that we breathe. And so when I think about your question of like, did racism impact me? I would say that there are just a lot of ways. Impacted me. Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Well, first
You're
of all,
like, where do I
I
begin?
grew up exactly.
Yeah.
Like I grew up in desegregating Virginia. I mean, North Carolina and Virginia. And I say desegregating just to underscore that it was an active aspect of my experience that we were in process. And I wouldn't say that process was ever fulfilled. In fact, we could talk about some of the ways the efforts were dismantled, even in the latter part of my experience of public school in the South. But certainly, I was a child who was bused across town to help accomplish these goals of a more integrated public school scenario. And, what are the impacts of being a part of that social experience, positive and negative. But what I'll say is one of the things that I saw, certainly most of us who grew up in desegregating circumstances saw, public schools that were very sensitively constructed to maintain appeal to white-bodied families. Mm-hmm. So teaching staffs that were disproportionately white, not integrated in the same way as maybe the classrooms even were. So most of my teachers were white. And most of course, the things that we learned in ways that were not always obvious were shaped around a kind of white Southern sensibility. That means that certain books were not taught, available. These were things that I had to find on my own. So for me, racism then showed up in those much more subtle ways of like what was available, what I was able to learn, what I was able to study, and what I wasn't, and by whom, and with whom, what kinds of teachers, and what kinds of experiences did they bring. But with all of that said, I can think of, and I want to say this explicitly, nevertheless, the teachers, the white body teachers who were there, most of whom in my experience were at least making an effort to do what they came to do, which is to help identify and, move through or support students with some potential in the conventional sense. And so I can certainly think of and have in my pantheon of teachers that I really appreciate, a lot of white teachers who were, I can think of, a couple in particular who were very, very instrumental in terms of their manifestation of, let's say, some sort of a racial equity commitment, such that whatever they may have been raised with, because again, these were people who were disproportionately raised in the South and with racist ideology and teachings having formed them. Many of them, nevertheless, were some of my, mentors and, help identify opportunities for me and so on and so forth. So I think it's not, and then when going to university, it was, I would say I saw more explicit examples of racism impacting me. For example, just in my first year at the University of Virginia, lovely school, but having examples of things like, instructors not having a negative reaction to me wanting to write about. For example, I had a paper topic that I proposed comparing an analysis of segregation in the southern United States with apartheid in South Africa. Today, I don't think people would think of that as like a shocking proposed experiment or, intellectual inquiry. But the particular teacher that I had, a teaching assistant that I had, was just aghast. How could they even be considered even remotely similar? Again, a white-bodied male teacher who was just coming from a perspective where something that was normalized in the U.S. as, part of our culture could not possibly be, this was in the 80s when we were in that anti-apartheid struggle. It was quite, seeing apartheid as a certain kind of evil that we needed to all, many of us, who were at all progressive were thinking that's an evil. But on the other hand, Southern segregation, well, there's so many justifications. Yeah. So that's an example, being sort of having my own education and my intellectual interests sort of filter through that lens of a kind of orientation toward whiteness that I think is a legacy of our racism and our white supremacy. So those are,
Thank you.
The more subtle ways. It wasn't until I came to California, actually, and heard the N-word hurled at me for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, no, that's maybe once before that when I was in Richmond, Virginia, but San Francisco, Richmond, Virginia. So it's when it comes to those experiences whereby personal racism in the form of, the epithets and the kinds of physical threat. This can happen in Richmond, Virginia or Hampton, Virginia, as well as Half Moon Base, California or San Francisco. This is American culture.
Yeah, thank you for all those differentiations and for telling that story. I actually do see value in differentiating between personal racism and systemic racism and acknowledging that both exist in lots of complex ways. So I really appreciate you telling that story. Hey everyone, I'm excited to announce that the 8-week online Transcend course is back. Become certified in learning the latest science of human potential and learn how to live a more fulfilling, meaningful, creative, and self-actualized life. The course starts March 13th of this year and goes until May 1st. The course includes more than 10 hours of recorded lectures, 4 live group Q&A sessions with me, 4 small group sessions with our world-class faculty, a plethora of resources and articles to support your learning, and an exclusive workbook of growth challenges that we think will help you overcome your deepest fears and grow as a whole person. There are even some personalized self-actualization coaching spots with me available as an add-on. Save your spot today by going to transcendcourse.com. That's transcendcourse.com. We have so much fun in this course, and I look forward to welcoming you to be a part of the Transcender community. Okay, now back to the show. When you were young, were there any mindfulness gurus that you liked? I'm curious, like when your kind of inroad into mindfulness was.
I'm sorry, my bells are here ringing.
That was a nice sound, actually.
Right. Yeah. I feel my coffee cup hit it. If I was taking, it's like, maybe we should pause.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know there are some, people who grew up with parents who were meditative. I grew up in a kind of a Southern Christian context. And so I will say that, a kind of a centering prayer kind of meditation was very much a part of my, kind of the context within which I grew up. I definitely had a grandmother who had been called to the ministry herself. And so what I, as a very little girl, witnessed when I would spend time with my grandmother, which I did fairly frequently. My parents were splitting up, so we were spending a lot of time there. I'd see my grandmother get up, before dawn, well before she had to, according to the things she needed to do for others or to make a living, and just spend time in what I later learned, right? First, it was a little girl seeing the light coming up from underneath her closed bedroom door and knowing, having been taught that, like, this is grandma's time, right? For her own cultivation, devotional practices. But later learning, this was a time of prayer and centering. She would then follow that up with, often she would come out and we would see her then reading scriptures, more prayer and praise and worship. And then, from there, getting everybody up and going and, getting us fed and getting us off to preschool or wherever we needed to go. And so I definitely saw that kind of devoted self-cultivation practice. But of course, it wasn't called mindfulness, right? And so it wasn't until, I had gone to university and come out to California and was in between law school and starting my first job as a lawyer. When I just realized I had been studying for so long. By then, I had also gone into Army ROTC and paid for school mostly. And also because it's a great way to learn certain things, but not because I'm pro-military, let's just say. I'm kind of a pacifist, let's just say at this point. But I did do Army ROTC. I'd studied, undergraduate. I'd done graduate school in sociology and law school. And I'd just been very, focused on all these, ways of developing in conventional ways, like so many students and those of us who are trying to make it in the U.S. And here I was for the first time in a long while, maybe the first time in my adult life, with having finished one major project, finished taking the bar. My job wasn't going to start for another couple months. And I just didn't know what to do with myself. I had just been so, so trained. My mind had been so trained to be constantly doing that I really could barely relax. And it just seemed to me, something inside spoke of a need to reconnect to some kind of nurturing, restorative way of being, because I just sort of had a sense that this was not a good way to start my new career, to be this kind of overwhelmed and overwrought. So I started, like many other people, just reading things. My partner, it's interesting. My partner his background is in engineering, and he's a patent lawyer. But his cultural heritage is that his parents immigrated from India. So he's not personally a meditator, but he had a book on his shelf that was called the Bhagavad Gita for Daily Living. And so he, and there's a whole nother story about that, about how as a child of immigrants from a culture which does meditate, coming to the U.S. and kind of acculturating and assimilating called forth this sort of, putting to one side of all of that. So he definitely wasn't even reading this book, but there it was on the shelf. And I read it and found in it descriptions of one-pointed meditation, a kind of way of calming and centering the mind, specifically offered as a translation of practice for daily living in the Western context. So it was being offered by an Indian American immigrant, whose name was Eknath Estoran, right? So he had written this book specifically to support this translation and this kind of, sharing of these practices to those of us in this culture. So, and I just named that because, sometimes when we think about how we come to these practices, we can be concerned about appropriation. We can be concerned about, how we often don't name the often Asian heritage cultures, very diverse in and among themselves, but these cultures that we are privileged to have received these teachings from, and to we'd often, often don't recognize the gift nature of how we, how they came to be here, and that there was this beautiful conscious interplay and interaction of cultures that I think is, again, part of the genius of the American experiment, however difficult it is for us to uphold it. Yeah, so for me, it was reading first and really experimenting at home and just feeling like, right away, like there's at least something here. Not something easy for me to actually practice, but something that with practice I might experience some greater ability to calm myself and to support myself on this journey. And so that's actually how it started, in my 20s, reading books, trying to sort of steady myself and save myself in a certain way. And it's interesting, because even though I was raised in a Christian household, there was some way in which, probably because of the way I've been doing certain kinds of mind training and higher education for so long, I needed a way of entering into these practices that specifically spoke to how to cultivate, and work with the qualities of the mind, and that really spoke about a kind of almost psychology of well-being. That's what we would call it now. It wasn't called that, but in other words, something that straight Christianity, in the way that I had been taught it, did not so much explicitly offer. So this is how I ended up, I think, just feeling a little bit more drawn to these teachings as a support.
Cool. I'm proud of your uniqueness in this space because you've brought together two things that are so important in the world today, but I don't see them going together as that frequently. So I want to brag about you is my point, because you made this connection, and I'm wondering sort of, so when did that career start where you had your personal awareness that, wow, a lot of these mindful techniques that you're reading about really can help heal racial divides, can really help with the inner work that we all can do. When did you start to form these connections? Because there is something really unique about that I associate with Rhonda Magee. Like there is like I think Rhonda Magee when I think about that, and that is kind of special. So I was wondering if you kind of comment on that. Yeah.
Thank you. It is a challenge sometimes to take that in, but I work with sort of, really just with humility, being in some sort of right relationship with this journey. And so I thank you for the question, and also for the acknowledgement. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean it.
Yeah, no, thanks. So I would just say that, it's hard to pinpoint any one moment, partly because, these are the sorts of things that just emerge in a way from one's own life experiences and innate, I think, passions, orientations, if you will. I think I was drawn always to more deeply trying to understand these divisions that we seem to have somehow inherited and invested in on so many different levels, and we're constantly seemingly try to reinvest in, rearticulate,
every generation.
Every generation, right?
I know. I always think about that. I always think about, like, can we ever reach a generation where we just learn from our past, like, completely? Like, we're all, we're like, you know what? We're done with all that crap.
It seems like we have to work really, really hard, doesn't it, Scott, to do that? I mean, because I do think I have that same. I had this conversation with friends just this weekend. Like, wow, it looks like we just keep doing the same thing over and over. There are certain
things, aspects of human. It was where I come in as a psychologist. There are certain aspects of human nature that make it likely that certain things will be created each generation. But there are also parts of human nature that can allow us to override it, right? And that's where you come in. That's where you come in.
Well, and that is exactly where I come in too. Right, where we come in. I think those of us who somehow are. I don't even know how we get here. I don't know, but we're certainly drawn to question how we could do things differently. And to me, just growing up, it was just so clear that there was so much unnecessary pain and division and missed opportunity for joy and just like really feeling, the miracle of what it means to be alive that's coming through all of this sort of acculturation to me, us versus them, me versus you, and then us versus them, and then, fear and the kind of machinations around how I can have enough. And it just, even as a very little girl, these questions about who we are fundamentally as human beings, the sense that we were all one human family, which is something I think my grandmother sort of conveyed in her interpretation.
I like your grandma. Everything I've heard today, I was like, I like your grandma.
Exactly. We need a grandmother like those. But like, there was always a sense that like, because we lived in a very segregated, neighborhood where I grew up. It was like all Black folk except, a couple of white men who ran some stores that we would go to, right? Some of the grocer, but otherwise, the original neighborhood that I grew up in and my kindergarten, completely all Black. And yet there was this sort of teaching that actually we're all God's children. We're all really one family, that's forgotten who we are. And, that was something that resonated with me innate. It never felt like it was just a teaching. It never felt like it was some story, like a metaphor. It always felt like, well, of course, and you could just tell we're all so similar in every kind of way. And yet we're so deeply trained for division. And so I think because of my own being drawn to that question, how can we both try and minimize the harm that comes from the legacies we've all, grown up in and with? How can we minimize, work for justice, in other words, but at the same time, keep our hearts open to the, to these many missed opportunities for connection. Keep our hearts open to what you in your writing, I think, call this sort of existential kind of gratefulness to be, but that comes with just being alive, right? We're right. How can we keep that? Yes. Which, again, to me, always seemed like an innate, of course. How can we keep those? How can we do both those things at once? That's the kind of a core koan, if you will, that I feel like my particular embodiment as a Black, racialized, as I call it, because, on the one hand, I accept these identity terms and talk about them, and in some ways, we're proud. But on the other hand, at the same time, know that these are just illusory ways we have of defining ourselves and others. And, as much as we can keep clear that to use those terms is not to reduce our entire sense of ourselves to those terms.
Right.
It can help us with this sort of perspective that I think is, what's called for if we ever are going to find a way to not keep recreating the same pain and hierarchy and work of justice every single generation.
Yeah. Yeah, there are illusionary ways of dividing. There are definitely ways of dividing. People have made those choices intentionally to use that as one of the main dividing ways, as opposed to the million other things about a human or an individual that we could focus on. So much of the beauty of the complexity of being human is just reduced to that one thing. And so, I hear you. Reading so much of your work, I mean, we could talk all day, right? I mean, there's so much to cover. You've had this whole 5-part, grounding. I can go through the whole thing, grounding, seeing. Let me just read them so it's on the record. Can I do that at least? Because they're just, I'm kind of overwhelmed because there's so much I want our listeners to hear about your work. But so you have the kind of these stages of the inner work process with mindfulness. With grounding is part 1. Part 2 is seeing. Part 3 is being. That's my favorite. If I'm allowed to pick a favorite, I like them all. I like them all. 3 is being, because and I resonate most because of my own work. I really love the being versus doing and the existential awareness, all that stuff. I love that. That's my jam. Part 4. Part 4 is doing. I was like, I don't know about that part. I'm joking.
And yet here you are doing in your own way.
And I'm doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. And then part 5, although this part 5 actually might be my favorite. Liberating.
Exactly.
Can we jump? Right. Can we just jump right to the liberating, because we don't have like 5 hours, right, to go through all that. And I do bring these up because I want our listeners to at least get it on the record, for them to hear it, and then for them to want to go and read more of your work, for sure. I really recommend people to. But in the interest of time, can you kind of tell us? What does it take to get to that point of liberation, and how do you define liberation? Different, through the centuries, through the course of human history, people have different thoughts and philosophies on what it means to be truly free and liberated. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you so much. And we absolutely can jump, because even though I have, articulated this sort of 5 part approach. And of course, by nature of a book, you start at the beginning, you end. To me, in common with people like, the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed recently.
May he rest in peace, yes.
May he rest in peace.
May he rest in liberation.
Yeah, may he rest in liberation. And may his teachings continue as he taught so often, right? They are here, right? In a certain sense, he's not resting.
Right.
We're here.
That's true.
But that this idea of interbeing, each of those, let's for now say aspects of the inner work that I describe in the book, certainly each embeds all the others. And so, yes, of course, we can start with liberation. We can start with any of them and see different aspects of the others within them. And certainly for me, I could well start any, in a certain sense, do begin my own work at this point from this place of, let's say, liberation from some of the ways I have been taught to think of my own self. You see me already kind of drawing in this sort of a fist to sort of self-contained, atomized. Right. I'm totally separate from you. We can't, we gotta struggle to understand each other and then defend each other.
Hearts with borders.
Hearts with borders,
with
right.
Borders,
exactly. Yeah, with borders. So to me, it's about that hearts beyond, right? And it's to me, liberation has really, as you allude to, it's so many different dimensions. But in this book, I am talking about a kind of spiritual, if you will, a kind of way of being in relationship to reality that is more and more kind of open to noticing when we're getting caught in ways of in limitation, in separation, in division, in reduction. It's really about the way that the practices of mindfulness, or just, if you will, kind of whatever the term is, any one of us may have for how it is that we work to disrupt our own delusions about who we are and how things are.
Yeah.
These practices for me can help with, to me, liberation is from what or for what. It's liberation from the temptation, the tendency toward isolation, towards a sense of self that to me is a delusion. It's at least in part a delusion, right? There's a way in which, of course, we have our own agency and our own work to do and opportunities, and we live and we love, and there's some reality to that. But I think as a kind of a metaphor for psychological development in a world in which everything is in interrelationship, it's important to notice when we're too focused on that sense of our bounded, ego-based, separate identity. And, to be engaged in a kind of set of practices that can deliver us when we're getting stuck.
Yeah.
So I keep coming back to this idea of stuckness and unstuckness
and,
opening up to psychological flexibility, social flexibility, existential flexibility. Like the world is constantly always changing. How can we, notwithstanding all these changes, notwithstanding demographic change, just to say one example, notwithstanding technological challenge or, the stress around resources that come from climate and other, issues that we are facing, notwithstanding all of that, how do we, notice the temptation to sort of orient ourselves from a place of fear and anxiety and notice what we can do within ourselves to open up to a place of spacious realization that we always have. Life itself affords us infinite options, infinite creative opportunities to respond to the challenges that we face. And to me, being in that liberating place is about, the practices. And I often do think of it again, it's like liberating, not liberation, right? It's like, how are we actively opening up whenever that temptation to close comes to all of us? And it can come to all of us. So with humility, this is like, I'm in this too. I open the news, the screens, and see, warmongering and saber rattling at the border of Russia and Ukraine, or whatever, at the border of the local school board that's arguing over critical race, something called critical race theory, and parents of like these things. Like, anybody needs to be pitting parents against anything in the context of public school, but that's happening in our neighborhoods. So wherever we see these border lines being redrawn, how are we in relationship to that, and how can we resist, the bait, not take the bait of making someone else an enemy? To me, every different way that we practice to minimize the likelihood that we do that, from which so much human suffering and needless bloodshed has flowed over human history over the eons. Everything we can do to minimize that falls within the scope of what I call liberating practices. And mindfulness and compassion and this existential gratitude, this gratitude in being alive, which I think, frankly, is kind of the core of mindfulness practice.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah.
I really, truly do. I don't think of that as a separate practice.
That's being. That's the core of being. Yeah.
That's being.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it comes from grounding in a certain awareness that life is selected for us. So no accident here. And as we breathe, we are in connectedness with this thing we call the environment out there, but actually it's always has been a part of our being, for which, again, seems to me the only right response is gratitude.
Yeah.
And then from there, again, so many different, opportunities to free ourselves can emerge if we keep remembering that these simple facts of our existence.
Beautiful. There's something you said I want to just double click on, because I very much agree with it. And it's that liberation I would phrase as a direction, not a destination, right? You never have become, because what happens the moment after? If you like, I'm liberated, then the moment after you're going to be like, wait, what do I do now with the rest of my life? It's always a process, right? And it's always a process. It's kind of like a North Star goal, right? I kind of view it like self-actualization. Right? We can constantly make choices in the course of our day to choose growth, but we'll mess up because we're human, right? It's not like, you ever reach the liberation, then you're like perfect the rest of your life.
Exactly.
So I like that you emphasize that. Something else I want to double click on from that chapter is the fact that you say bringing compassionate mindfulness into community-based engagement. Well, this is a common thread throughout the whole book. So even earlier in the book, you say, as you'll see from my story and those of others you'll meet here, healing takes place in community. So this is a theme you keep coming back to over and over again. You brought up the critical race theory kind of criticisms, and those discussions get so ugly, regardless of where you stand on. I want us to step above that for a second and not get into the weeds of the debate. I want to say, because I know that's where you're at with this. So I love it. Regardless of where you stand, no one's listening to anyone in this, right? And everyone's just yelling at each other. And so how can we all rise above that using your amazing work of mindfulness, of the community healing, and then truly, truly listening to each other? Because this is the society I think we both want. It's more of this active listening and less immediate knee-jerk response of you're wrong, I'm right.
Right. I think of these things on multiple levels, right? There are things that we can do, and we will do, and we are doing even in this conversation, I would say.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
To
hell yeah.
offer. Yeah, right. Models and ways of kind of practicing listening for understanding and connection. And really, that could be his whole spiritual path.
Yeah.
I think, right? And a whole self-development path. How can I practice listening and speaking for connection and understanding? What are the other goals that people have for listening and speaking other than, right? Because to practice for understanding and connection is to invite inquiry. Well, what are the, what else are we trying to do with some of our communications? Are we trying to understand or are we trying to experience power over in some way?
Be right.
Be right, but also
right.
come across as right. But again, even more so now, the systemic collective piece. All of this is happening within a broader environment. It's not just the interpersonal dynamics, which are so important and which we, we recognize and we take agency for and all. Yes. And right. We live in a world, people are making money, making aggrandizing and developing and building up power through the manipulations of our emotions, our communities, frankly, so in other words, we're up against a lot right now when it comes to this. Being willing to see more clearly, more of what we're up against. That it isn't just, I'm not skillful or I'm not being the best person. It is that. It is part of, it's partly like, can I be more skillful? Can I listen a little bit more with a little less judgment? Right. Like a little less judgment. And can I put myself in the shoes of the other a little bit more? But it is also, recognizing that we, on the one hand, have these beautiful, lovely devices around us that have enabled so much, including us connecting and sharing more richly in the world during these pandemic times. Beautiful. Yeah. Absolutely. Where would I be without these devices? And the way they have been developed and promulgated, we all now know, churns division, right? Is kind of has as a profit model, the narrowing of minds and the kind of the reinforcing of, those things that trigger intense emotion, including fear, anxiety, that lead to this othering. So there is, so this is where, that strong back, that sort of, how do we act in wise relationship, not only to how our own personal conditionings, our upbringings, right, the things we've learned, the things we haven't, prefigure us to be open or not to what we are hearing from another person. That's really important. And that's, we have some control over that. We must make the most of that. And I think how we relate to technology and media and the different ways that organized efforts are arrayed at kind of keeping us deluded and keeping us at, loggerheads and at pointed spears at each other. I mean, this is not just happening. It's not just natural. So how are we in wise relationship with the whole array, from like my personal, what's happening interpersonally, how and where we meet, the structures for that, because all of those things are part of I would say, the ecology for justice and for connection that we work with. Like, so bringing awareness to every dimension, the personal, the interpersonal, the sort of social, where we meet and how, who's in charge and right, how we set up the rooms, all of these things matter. But also this, really hard, first world, high level, edgy problem of existential crisis of how we relate with technology more wisely.
Yes.
All of that has to be brought into our conversation. And I think we can, though, with compassion.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, and I would end this and say that I see the media, mainstream media, as a big problem with the silos of the very, like CNN versus Fox News, for instance. Like, you couldn't talk about two completely different worlds with two completely different worldviews about humanity. We need like a different. Like, I want to opt out of all of that and have like a oneness news channel. or something
Yeah.
that takes into account the principles you put forward in your liberating chapter.
Yeah.
Things like expanding the circle of compassion, deepening healing for ourselves, contemplating all humanity as one family, deepening the path of wisdom. Where's that in the news cycle?
Exactly. Where's the PR
Yeah,
campaign for all of
for
that good
that.
stuff,
For
right?
that.
It is seriously. Well, I
There's no
mean,
money in it? Is it all about money? Is
there's
that
no
what it is?
money
Oh,
and power over.
ugh.
There's no money and power over, right? As opposed to power with,
With.
or right,
Why is there
power.
not money equally as much money and power with? How do we have that world?
Well, there is at least some, and I think that's
Yeah.
part of that. That is a part of the reality. Like,
Yeah.
we are finding ways
Yeah.
to amplify more of the good.
Mm.
But it is true. I mean, some of it isn't saleable, and some of it will never be.
Mm.
Something that we can profiteer off of, and shouldn't be.
Right.
Frankly. And this is radically counterculture for me to talk about, like, things we should be engaged in that will never make us money and shouldn't be about making us money.
Yeah. That's not the
But
bottom
I
line.
think that's, it's again, this is where, again, my heart, I have to put a hand over the heart, because
I'll do it too.
we are,
I'll do it too.
it's painful.
It is.
It is.
Well, so many people are
to
suffering.
both.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go on.
So
Go on.
we're all suffering.
Yeah.
We're all suffering.
I know.
In different ways,
Yeah.
right?
I didn't
In
mean to
different
interrupt you.
ways.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't. I take this as
Okay, good. Yeah.
like healthy.
Yeah, you
like
inspired
we're
me.
engaged.
Yeah, you inspired me.
Yeah, we're inspiring each other. You're inspiring me.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I, we could talk about this forever, and hopefully in a certain way we will, if not explicitly, but just know we're in conversation wherever we are about these really, really important aspects of in a way the dilemma. So I mean, I guess I would say, because I'm have been trained in law and worked as a law professor for so many years, I am kind of aware that, again, life. Law professor and mindfulness teacher. Life is multidimensional. My existence is multidimensional. It's like, I can at the same time be aware of the oneness that interconnects us all, us as, as being part of one family already, who all belong already, and don't really have to struggle for that. And at the same time, recognize that for us to work together in the world to minimize the harm that we do as we go forth, seeking to make the most of our own agency in the social realm. We do need agreements. We do need ways of working together. And we do need ways of trying to find collective consensus or nonviolent ways of resolving conflict.
Here.
So so there are. I think. Therefore, I'm always trying to be a student of, political science and philosophy, and if someone could show me a more effective way for human beings to come together than the hard work of trying to, despite our different backgrounds, despite our different languages, despite our different cultures, find the common ground in any conversation, in any community. Find the capacity to resolve a conflict peacefully for today. Provisionally, we know we may come back again, but for today, we've agreed this is how we'll resolve it, and we'll live another day to meet and share and maybe come to another result. In other words, what we have called the rule of law and democracy, as opposed to every other kind of way, seems to be the best approximation we can find for a kind of public frame for discourse that allows for, more free expression, more of these liberating practices, right? More of us to kind of find our own way. And so while, I'm aware that, democratic rule of law activity, political realm is not necessarily the ultimate. When I think about, just the basic challenge of like living with neighbors who come from different parts of the world. And, it helps to have rules by which we drive on this side of the road and not that side, and we stop at the stop sign. I mean, it's just basic things that keep us from killing each other.
Yeah.
To kind of arrive at those kinds of
or hating each other. Yeah.
Right. We don't need to hate to have a provisional consensus.
Yeah.
These ways of coming at provisional consensus. That's what, to me, law has always been, at its highest and best, is seeking to help us do. And so we have to keep investing in the inputs of the ability to use language, as bad as it is, right?
Yeah.
As manipulable as it is. But nevertheless, we have to resist that cynicism that says, words don't matter, and trying to talk to each other and listen to each other is just, we never will work. I think we have to pull ourselves back. Always the temptation is to pull ourselves back from the kind of abyss of cynicism that can come from this kind of awareness of the infallibility of language, or, the kind of indeterminacy of it. Like, the word dignity can mean anything. I could use it. Hitler could use it. I mean, it's like, nevertheless, if we can come together around the circles, around the tables, the campfires, starting at home, in our community, in our schools, with humility, with love, if you will, I'm going to say that word in this podcast, right?
Please do.
With love, with care.
Yeah.
Then, all we can do is keep meeting each other around that campfire with some commitment to care, and figuring out what language works for today, and maybe use another language tomorrow, but not missing that we're just human beings struggling to find what works to keep us from killing each other, frankly, and keep us thriving in the abundant appreciation of the gift of this life.
Beautiful. I'm going to end quoting you. You say, I have suffered enough. You have suffered enough. We have all suffered enough. May we bring ourselves into continual conversation with one another and with the racial injustices here and now, ending the suffering and making things right. One moment, one risk, one luminous reconnection at a time. I'm really glad to make a connection with you. I look forward to a reconnection another time. Thanks for the real important work you're doing in this world. I really support it. And thanks for being on my show today.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Scott. Same. I reflect that all back to you. Thank you for your really important work. And it's an honor to be in this conversation with you. Yes, may it continue in some ways, explicit and implicit, from here.
Heck yeah. Thanks, Rhonda.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.